Hello, everybody. This is Elise Hunter and Rory Cowan from SDS Global Services. Welcome to the Future of Climate Leadership webinar. Just a couple housekeeping items before we get started. It's around 11 a.m. Just wanted to let everyone know that we will have a recording of this presentation available after it is over. And we'll take questions at the end. So we've muted all the attendees, but we'll unmute everybody at the end of the presentation. And you're also welcome to use the chat function that you see on your screen to ask questions throughout the presentation. We'll be taking note of those questions, and we'll take those questions at the end. Also, if you happen to have any AV issues or if you have trouble hearing us, also feel free to use the chat function and we'll troubleshoot to the best of our abilities. And I'm going to let Rory take it from here.
Okay. Thank you very much, Elise. So this is just the agenda for the next hour. I won't go through it in any detail right now, but just to give you guys an idea of what you'll be seeing. And then I will move right along to I would also like to introduce Steve Tochelin and Stephanie Zhu from Delta Airlines, their environmental sustainability team, as well as Candace Watson from Fruit of the Loom. They'll be presenting their case studies at some point after I give you this little overview, and then I will talk about verification in further detail. So I'd like to start out with what is a carbon footprint. And essentially your footprint is the sum of all your greenhouse gases emitted into the atmosphere by your company, which includes direct, indirect, and then optional sources as well. So what are the different scopes? Scope 1 are direct emissions. These result from mobile combustion of fossil fuels. This might be gasoline used in your company fleet. It might be stationary combustion of fossil fuels, so maybe you have an emergency generator that runs on diesel, or fugitive emissions from refrigerants in your HVAC system, or if your company uses any foam blowing agents, things along those lines. Scope 2 emissions are indirect emissions. These result from purchased electricity, purchased heating, purchased cooling that are imported onto your facility or to your company and that are consumed on site. And then last but not least, Scope 3 is optional. These are generally emissions that are a result of upstream or downstream supply chain decisions. So this might be contracted transportation of your product to get from your warehouse to the buyer. It might be employee travel. It might be business travel. It might be hotel stays or anything along those lines. Yeah, that's Scope 3. So to have your footprint verified, when you develop your footprint, you are going to choose a standard or protocol, which we'll talk about in further detail in a little bit. And when we come in to do verification, we're going to assess your footprint against that standard that you've chosen. When you're choosing a verifier, we recommend that you select an accredited third party. This means that you are looking for a verification body that is accredited by another party, like the American National Standards Institute, to the ISO 14065 standard. And I know that's a mouthful. So ISO is the International Organization for Standardization, and 14065 is the standard for greenhouse gas requirements for greenhouse gas validation and verification bodies for use in accreditation. This basically just means that when you're choosing an accredited verification body, that it doesn't matter which body you choose, but that they will all be conducting their verifications uniformly in accordance with one standard. When you are scoping out the verification with your verification body, you'll have to choose a level of assurance, and generally there are 3 levels of assurance that are optional, that are options. The first being limited, so this means that we look at just enough data that we feel mostly confident that your data is correct, and the verification statement tends to be fairly negatively stated, like we didn't find any errors and therefore we think this GHG assertion is correct. There's also reasonable assurance, so this means that we look at enough of the data that we can feel reasonably confident that your GHG assertion is correct. We look at a sample, but we don't look at everything. And then last but not least, there's full assurance, and this means that we look at every document, every calculation, and interview every person possible. Most companies don't go with full assurance because it tends to be very timely and very costly. By having your footprint verified, this can enable you to report to a registry. So if you report to the climate registry per se, you have to have your carbon footprint verified by a third party. Or if you are reporting to the Carbon Disclosure Project, which will also be referred to as CDP, then you can get the verification points for electing to have your footprint verified. The next bullet point I'm going to hold on to for later because we'll go into in more depth in a little bit. But at this point, I would like to hand over the microphone to Steve Tochlin and Stephanie Zhu from Delta to tell you about their carbon footprinting experience.
So for Delta, the two most important reasons for compiling an inventory is transparency and credibility. So Delta and the airline industry actually uses 2005 and 2009 as a baseline to compare progress against. So we thought it was important to have the baseline year and all the subsequent years verified so that when we talk about changes in the carbon footprint, it could be publicly tracked and we can explain the changes. And the other reason is credibility, and Rory touched on this a little bit earlier, but it's to ensure that, when we talk about our carbon footprint, the numbers, changes in our corporate responsibility report, the DJSI, and the CDP every year, we're using the same numbers, and anybody looking at it can say these numbers have been verified, and we're talking about the same story year after year. Next slide.
Next slide.
So just to give an overview of Delta's carbon footprint, as you can see in the bar chart, the two blue bars are actually representative of emissions from jet fuel, so that accounts for more than 98% of it. The dark blue bar is emissions from Delta's mainline aircraft. It's all Scope 1, and then regional aircraft accounts under Scope 3, and then the other sources, which you can see on the breakdown pie chart on the side, only account for about 1.5%, and that's everything from electricity, ground support equipment, chemicals, refrigerants, emergency generators, and fire pumps. So just one thing to note here when we were compiling our inventory, so because jet fuel is such a large part of Delta's expenses, we can get the total amount that we spend on jet fuel and the total gallons of jet fuel pretty quickly from our fuel group and finance group, and that was a pretty quick calculation to figure out 98% of our inventory. But the other sources that you see that account for the 1.5% actually took more time, at about 98% of the time, for us to be able to drill down and get accurate information, especially when we were doing this back to 2005. So that's actually the area where we're still trying to refine the information and look for more streamlined ways to collect information going forward. Next slide. And just as a note, the 2013 emissions haven't been verified yet, but we're on our way to doing that, and that's also actually going to include our Trainer refinery, but as a separate line item from Delta, so we're not, adding those emissions into the Delta baseline just starting in 2013. So having our emissions verified and calculated every year allows us to track our progress against our goals. So one of our internal goals is actually to reduce our total greenhouse gas emissions below the previous year's levels. And in 2013, we didn't quite meet this goal, and that was due to more flying and also a little bit of a slower retirement of the more inefficient 50-seaters, so a slower bringing in of the more efficient aircraft. Hopefully in 2014 we'll see a bit of a difference in this. So we're actually, for the 2013 inventory, looking at retiring a set of carbon offsets, and we'll be working with the Climate Registry and also SCS to include that into our verification process and have that also publicly stated in the TCR domain. Next slide. So there's also an industry goal, and Delta has adopted this industry goal, and it's to reduce our fuel improve our fuel efficiency. So by reducing fuel use 1.5% every year from 2009 to 2020, so using 1.5% less fuel to transport the same amount of weight, the same distance, so 100 revenue ton kilometers. So for an absolute goal for Delta may have the potential to hinder growth, since 90% of the emissions are jet fuel. In order to reduce that, you have to basically use less jet fuel, and more efficient aircraft might not be as quickly or readily available. So having an efficiency goal like this allows for Delta to still continue to grow and, you know, maybe use more fuel, but at least at a more efficient rate. So those are Delta's two goals that we use our verified inventory to track against.
So the airline industry is unusual, if not unique, in having coalesced around a global set of goals for the entire commercial airline industry, which include the 1.5% annual fuel efficiency improvement goal that Stephanie described, and that's for the period from 2009 as a baseline through 2020. At that point, the airlines are on board with achieving carbon neutral growth at that point, so there will be no future increase in emissions above where we are in 2020, and by 2050, when we think aircraft technology will have advanced quite a bit, we're committing to a 50% reduction, although I won't be on this call in 2050, so I guess you can't really hold me to that, but that's the airline's goal anyway. And the airline industry has also coalesced around 4 large pillars: technology, operations, infrastructure, and economic measures that we will use to reach these 3 goals. And I will describe each of those in a little bit of detail on the following slides. So the next slide is technology. The obvious easiest way to reduce your emissions is new airplanes, especially bigger airplanes. Bigger airplanes tend to be more fuel efficient than small airplanes, and so part of the strategy is not just new airplanes, but new, bigger airplanes, and taking smaller airplanes out of the fleet. The new ones are much more efficient, but there's a challenge to introducing them, because since the technology tends to kind of change leapfrog style, and you're ordering 5 to 10 years down the road in most cases, you're kind of guessing what the technology is going to be. Placing an order now kind of gets you planes in the 2017 to 2020 range, so you're locking into that technology, where by the time 2017 comes, the technology the aircraft are produced, the manufacturers are announcing at that point, is another leap ahead. Aircraft last for 20 years or more, in some cases many more years, and so it's difficult to change your fleet over. In Delta's case, we have over 700 mainline fleet, over 500 regional aircraft at an average cost of $50 to $150 million a piece. Pretty expensive to turn your fleet over. So those are some of the challenges, although all the airlines are committed to improving their fleets because the cost of fuel is our largest single cost. Investments in your existing fleet are another strategy that the airlines are using. Winglets are a visible addition to planes that improve efficiency around 2 to 4% depending on the usage of that aircraft. And removing unnecessary weight, for example, some things as simple as how much water we board on the plane for hand washing and coffee and so on. How much ice we put on the plane is even a factor. The types of seats, thinner back seats and so on, taking hard walls off of planes and using curtains instead. Even the containers we use for packaging luggage or for accumulating luggage are going to plastics instead of metals. Maintenance changes, frequent engine washes, so we have more fuel-efficient engines. Washing of the control surfaces on the planes is another strategy, and keeping the plane really tweaked in terms of the flaps and slats. Alternative fuels are a promising area down the road. The airlines right now aren't doing much more than demonstrating that they're safe and viable, but there's a lot of logistical challenges, such as how do you produce billions of gallons of jet fuel without creating social and economic problems. So that's still to be determined how we can best integrate alternative fuels. So operationally, we're looking at how we can use our existing fleet better. Flight planning plays a big part in that. The route, how we get from point A to point B, flying it more directly versus kind of a connect the dots approach. How fast you fly there, what altitude you fly out, all affect how much fuel you use on a flight. Taxi procedures, airlines for years have been using single engine taxis. We're looking at ways to even tow the planes out on the taxiways in some situations. Takeoff procedures, reduced thrust takeoffs are pretty common these days, slower cruising speeds. Using tractors, like as is pictured there in the middle slide, to move airplanes around rather than taxiing them with their own engines and burning jet fuel. Reduced usage of the auxiliary power unit, which is a small jet engine at the rear of the plane that is used to provide air conditioning and power while you're on the ground. That can be done with external devices much more fuel efficiently. Continuous descent arrivals, as depicted there in the bottom left-hand side, something called optimized profile descents are being evaluated, where you can descend according to the green path, where you're basically gliding down rather than the more traditional step-down approach where you're decelerating and then speeding up again and then decelerating. And adjusting schedules to account for better usage of the plane, so everybody doesn't arrive at once and sit around burning jet fuel while you're waiting to get to your gate or waiting to take off. So those are all examples of how airlines are operating their fleets more fuel efficiently. The next slide talks about what we call infrastructure. That refers to the air traffic control systems where the airlines partner with the governments, for example, the FAA here in the United States, to implement more of a satellite-based control system, which is much more fuel efficient than the ground-based system that those are replacing. So you'll hear the term next-gen used quite a bit, where both the government and the airlines are installing equipment so that the satellites can talk to the planes and vice versa. And in Europe, there's a program called CSAR, which stands for Single European Skies, Air Traffic Management Research. And that's basically the equivalent where the FAA in Europe and other countries are cooperating. You can see a diagram on the bottom right that shows how there's a program across the Atlantic that is looking at how to save fuel during all phases of flight. One of the big challenges here is money. This stuff is expensive for both the government and the airlines are reluctant to spend millions of dollars per airplane on upgrades until the government installs the satellites to talk to, and the government has to go through various rounds of congressional funding where things are added and cut. So since it's a multi-year program, it's hard to get continuity in that, but the FAA is determined to press forward, and the airlines are certainly anxious to cooperate on that. And then the fourth pillar, the next slide, shows what we consider to be a stopgap measure. If you look at the graph there, there's three different shades of green depicting the impact of the reduction in emissions from technology, operations, and infrastructure. But all those aren't going to kick in sufficiently by 2020 to allow us to do carbon neutral growth. So we anticipate there'll be a period there shown by that shaded red area where the airlines will need to somehow offset their emissions while we're waiting for new aircraft and next gen and all those things to really get up to speed, biofuels as well. So we anticipate at least a 10 to 20 year period where we'll need to be buying some volume of offsets, and there's a lot of talk right now about what we call market-based measures and how that system will work globally. The advantage for the airlines is we only have to pay once for emissions rather than paying 2 or 3 different times for the same emissions, because one country charges us a fuel tax, one country charges us an emissions tax, another country makes us do carbon trading and so on. So we're moving forward with that, and Delta's very active in helping move this along. Lastly, my last slide just shows how we're engaging groups throughout the company on various aspects of environmental sustainability, not just reducing emissions and fuel use, but also engaging employees and passengers on recycling programs, on alternative commuting to get to work, on teleworking so they don't even have to come to work, on volunteerism, and on carbon offsetting with our partner, the Nature Conservancy. And that's it for us.
Great, thank you, Steve. That was Steve Tochelin and Stephanie Zhu from Delta Airlines. Now we have the Fruit of the Loom case study, and I am going to unmute Candace Watson from Fruit of the Loom. Candace, are you there?
Yes, I am. Okay, so Fruit of the Loom started its phase 1 of their sustainability program in 2007, and we tracked our 4 major areas of consumption, which included energy, transportation, chemical consumption, and waste. That includes fabric, cardboard, packaging materials, whatever it may be, and then just general household trash. So some of the challenges that we face in the textile industry is that, you know, like Delta, our equipment lasts for 25 to 30 years. So, you know, suggesting that we just do an entire equipment overhaul to get better, more efficient equipment is something that is planned and takes a long time to implement. We also have the challenges of how much we have to drive our products around to either get them between sites so that they, you know, in the order of manufacturing processes, as well as getting them to our consumer with different retailers. So we do travel millions of miles every year just getting our products around. And then there's electricity and chemicals. So the yarn mills, which is a part of our process, they are probably the largest consuming facility in the U.S. At this point. We use a lot of electricity just spinning yarn, and it's better if you operate those facilities at a 24-hour period. So since 2007, we've been looking at ways to reduce our electricity consumption. We've probably implemented every lighting retrofit and energy efficient computer program at most of our facilities that was available, and at this point we feel like we've maximized our efficiency. And then chemicals, which have a lot of impacts, but through our chemical program, we do not allow any hazardous materials in our facilities, and we try to process with the most environmentally friendly chemicals possible. Next slide. So since 2007, the sustainability program that we have is called the Environmental Excellence Project. And since 2007, we've completed over 1,000 projects, and I think that number is actually up to 1,300 as of through 2013. So we tracked our emissions reductions internally from 2007 to probably 2011, and we basically used the GHG protocol. And we boasted numbers such as reducing, 280,000 tons of carbon dioxide, which you can see here on the slide. So every year we have set a goal to reduce our emissions by 1.25% per pound of production. And basically what we calculated, or how we calculated that, was we looked at our electricity and our transportation miles and some of our chemical usage that does have emissions, added all of that up, and divided it by our pounds of production for that year, and then used GHG protocol standard emissions factors and came up with what we thought we had saved that year. So through these projects, we've calculated reductions in electricity of over 365 million kilowatts, which this includes our North American plants, so Canada, U.S., and then El Salvador, Mexico, Honduras, and some other smaller ones below the Texas line there. Next slide, please. So in 2012, in the background, we were embarking on a very large project that was going to have a significant impact in us reducing our GHG emissions. And at that time, you know, everybody can brag about themselves, but it's better if someone can validate you. So we did some background research to figure out what we could do to make up this large claim that we knew we were going to make in the coming years. So we found SCS, and they independently verified our 2012 baseline year. So that was our starting point. We wanted to see what our emissions were, you know, compared to what we were reporting internally, compared to actually having a protocol and a set plan and measures. So we, SCS verified our 2012 GHG emissions. We use that as our baseline to start phase 2 of our sustainability program. And I mean, and this is like a no-brainer now that I look back on it, but when I started working for Fruit in 2011 and I'm looking at their sustainability program, it was kind of hard to identify exactly which was our biggest elephant in the room that we needed to attack. I mean, obviously electricity was, but I thought our chemical consumption would actually be closer to our electricity, but as you can see here in this pie graph, most of our GHG emissions come from electricity, and then every other fuel that we use to operate and manufacture, they're all relatively close. So that was kind of an eye-opener. Probably should have been a no-brainer when I started, but yeah, so it was good to see that, and then it made sense to go to our senior leadership and say, okay, here's the numbers. If you want to reduce our GHG emissions, we really have to start attacking electricity. And if you recall, I had already mentioned that we were kind of at a dead end, and we really didn't think there was any other way we could be more energy efficient. So, and another reason why we wanted to get our data third-party verified is that we really needed a reputable method. Walmart is one of our largest customers, and they are probably, you know, pushing out a lot of sustainability guidelines to all of their suppliers. So they're putting the pressure on us. It was time that we really kind of stepped up our game. So if you can advance to the next slide, please. Yes, and just so what was verified in our data, we focused on our facilities in the Western Hemisphere, which includes the countries listed there. There are 45 individual plants/facilities that were included in the scope of our data being verified. We looked at our Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. We're kind of new to this. We're getting our feet wet, but we definitely want to include our Scope 3 at some point just because our company does do a lot of traveling. So what we came up with is our Scope 1 emissions were about 85,500, and our Scope 2 was over 200,000. And basically, this just gave us our starting point. So if we wanted to reduce our GHG emissions, and I think our industry standard is 20%, we know that these are the numbers that we're working with. And we also know that electricity is the biggest contributor to our emissions. So we really needed to focus on Scope 2. Next slide, please. So in 2007, there was talk throughout our company of us building biomass plants to support our Honduran facilities. We have a significant number of facilities in Honduras. I think we're up to about 13, and that just includes sewing facilities and a large dyeing and knitting and finishing operation, 2 of those actually. So in 2012, we broke ground and we started construction. Some highlights of this, which there's a short video in a minute that you'll see, which will kind of do this project more justice than I will. But combined, both of our biomass plants are have a capacity of 39.2 megawatts. And our startup is July 14th, so we're just on the cusp of it, and everybody's really excited to throw the switch and hope that we hear the hum of a generator when it happens, so that'll be really good. And with this project and some of our other initiatives that we have going on internally, we expect to reduce our Scope 2 emissions below 100,000 tons. Next slide, and I'll show you how we're going to do that. So what this graph is basically showing you, in 2012, all of our electricity consumption, all 440 million kilowatt hours, came from fossil fuels. And in 2015, although our project is starting up in 2014, we just like to say that for our first full year with the 2 biomass plants, and we also have a hydroelectric that's coming online, this will be our new energy profile. And basically, we are going to reduce our fossil fuel electricity consumption by 71%. So the majority of our facilities in the Western Hemisphere will be, quote unquote, supplied by biomass electricity. And the reason why we did this, or how we're doing this and how we're able to account for this, is that our capacity at these 2 plants is more than our consumption there. So we're wheeling a lot of it back to the grid, which will then act as carbon credits for our company. So with that, we boasted this year that we would be able to reduce our electricity-related GHG emissions by 40%, which is double what our industry standard is. So we're very excited about this, and now I'll just play a short video about our biomass plant.
Since 2011, Fruit of the Loom, the leading global underwear and casual wear company, has operated a biomass power plant that generates steam and energy from dedicated energy crops. The power plant currently generates 2 megawatts of electricity and 35 tons of steam per hour. Throughout its 8,000-hour per year operation, it consumes 87,000 tons of king grass. Always in search of continuous improvement in its operations and environmental sustainability, Fruit of the Loom is investing in 2 new biomass power plants based on the combustion of dedicated energy crops. Each power plant is capable of producing 18.6 megawatts of electricity, which supply its own internal energy needs, as well as provide surplus electricity to be sold to the national grid. With these new plants, located in the industrial area of Cortez, Honduras, there will be a new total generation capacity of 39.2 megawatts. This form of electricity generation will be used in Fruit of the Loom's 2 textile plants and 7 sewing facilities in the country, resulting in a reliable energy source as well as actual cost savings. We use 2 words to communicate our sustainability focus: empower and preserve. Empowering our people and preserving our natural resources. As proud as we are of our past accomplishments, we know that we must focus on continually improving. As we continue to grow and expand globally, our pledge is to further our commitment to our people and our planet. We know that our ability to compete, and hence our future, depends on our capacity to make good on that commitment for our company, our employees, and our communities.
Right, and that concludes my presentation.
Thank you very much, Candace. You guys, both you, Stephanie, and Steve did a fantastic job of talking through the next slide. Oops. There we go. Which is the value of third-party verification. And in the interest of time, I'm going to run through these really quickly, especially because you guys made the argument much better than I could at this point. But as Steve stated, you know, when you're when you're watching your emissions that closely, you can see emission reductions tied very directly to financial savings. One thing that they didn't talk about was managing risk. So if you operate in California or Massachusetts, you might be required to report, but maybe you're in a state that has a forthcoming reporting regulation, and so if you start tracking your carbon footprint now, then you can get ahead of that regulation. Or maybe if you, like Fruit of the Loom, are very dependent on electricity for your operations, you can get ahead of any energy price changes that would greatly change the way that your profits, And then competitive advantage. Fruit of the Loom is better than, or it's not better, but they can use this footprint claim to set themselves apart from their competition. So Haynes might not be actively tracking their footprint, and they can't put a per unit footprint on their products. And last but not least, using a verified carbon footprint allows you to provide credibility when making any environmental claims, and it also allows you to become a thought leader in your industry. SCS is an accredited verification body on behalf of the Climate Registry. CDP also accepts our verification statements and awards additional points if you report to CDP. In terms of the protocols, we have done many audits to the World Resources Institute / World Business Council for Sustainable Development's GHG protocol. Try saying that 3 times fast. And last but not least, we are recognized by the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection for their mandatory reporting program for verification as well. So I will go through this fairly quickly and at a high level, but this is the process in a nutshell. We start with a kickoff call. This allows the audit team and the client to get to know each other, to confirm the scope, making sure everybody's on the same page, and also to start scheduling the site visit tentatively. We ask for your documentation. Once we get that, we begin our desk review. This allows us to do a risk assessment. So we're looking at all the different parameters of your inventory. We want to see who are the personnel that are managing it, aggregating, collecting. We want to know what kind of data management systems you have. We want to see what kind of calculations you have, things like that. So based on the risk assessment, we create a sampling plan, and this says we want to look at these invoices from this facility, and we want to interview this person so that we can better ascertain if your GHG assertion is correct. Once we've created a sampling plan, that allows us to develop an audit plan, which generally contains an audit agenda, and this will say which facilities we want to visit, which invoices we might want to pull, which records we might want to see, who we might want to interview while we're on site. The site visit is pretty self-explanatory. We are going to get a tour of your different facilities. We might have you walk us through the calculations because it's not always obvious to us what you've done in an Excel spreadsheet or an Access database. We're going to interview people. We're looking for things that maybe you've omitted or overstated or just nobody's perfect, and this is part of the audit. Generally, after the audit, we issue findings. We either need more information to determine conformance with your chosen protocol, or we found an error. So you've used the wrong emission factor, or you've miscalculated something, and you have every chance in the world to correct those before we go to drafting the report. We draft the report once all the findings are closed, and we also firm up our audit trail on our end internally before we hand that off to the technical reviewer. The technical reviewer is another lead auditor who's been independent of the audit, and they're looking at the work that we've done to make sure that we haven't missed any glaring errors, that we've scoped it correctly. It's basically an audit of our audit. Once the report is approved by the technical reviewer, we hand it over to you, the client, for your review to make sure that we haven't misstated anything like, we haven't misspelled your name or gotten a date wrong, pretty immaterial things. When you've approved the draft report, we finalize it, and then if you're reporting to TCR, we will upload the verification statement. Or if you're reporting to CDP, then we send you the verification statement and you send that to the registry. If you're reporting to either of those, they might review and come back with questions, and we try our best to answer those questions right away without involving you. But that's just the end part of the process before your report can be made public. From there, your report gets made public, and that's the end, and you're done for the year. Now, I know this is why you guys are all tuned in today, to understand how to have a painless audit. So one of the first things I can tell you is make your documentation readily available and transparent. Make sure that when I open the Excel spreadsheet, I can follow along and understand what's going on. If you're sending over documents that are all handwritten in your very fancy cursive writing that I might not understand, please make sure that it's really easy for your auditor to understand. Additionally, I highly encourage you to develop an inventory management plan. This is essentially your Bible. It should capture the roles and responsibilities. It should capture any assumptions you're making, what your sources are, how you're tracking them, what the management systems are doing. This is a great tool for you to remember, to help you remember from year to year what you've done. And should you win the lottery tomorrow and quit your job, the person who picks it up behind you can have some sort of understanding and continuity from year to year. Clarity of documentation goes with the above too. I do want to stress about having the right people available for the site visit. So if we go to a facility and the person that does all the data collection for that facility is on vacation that day, it's really hard for us to assess the process of data collection, and we want to be able to talk to that person. So it's important to make sure that we can talk to anybody who's involved in the process as we've talked about it in the audit agenda. Additionally, we encourage you to respond to findings quickly. Do it while it's all fresh in your brain, while you understand what you did 3 months ago. If we issue you findings and you come back 6 months later, it's really hard for us to pick up and remember where we were 6 months before and why we did the things we did, even though we do try to document it very well along the way. Timeline reminders, I'm also going to put expectations at the end of that bullet. If you have a deadline in which you need your verification statement, please make sure to stress this at the beginning of the audit, at the middle of the audit, and right before the end. It's really important that everybody's on the same page, and one of the things that we've learned is really helpful is during the kickoff call, we start with your deadline, your drop dead date, and then we work backwards from there so we understand who needs to do what by when, and that everybody can be on the same timeline. Reasonable expectations, very important. If you respond to findings today, please do not expect me to have your report drafted by tomorrow. As much as we love working with you, we have a full plate most of the time, and so we try to schedule things accordingly. But just having a little bit of breathing room is very important. And last but not least, it's not life or death. This is a voluntary audit for the most part. You've elected to have us come. We try to work with you as much as possible without consulting. And you know, a lot of people hear the word audit and they think, oh, compliance, and oh no, we're going to get a fine. That's not the way this goes. Just keep that in mind when you get into your audit. This question is a wide open question. Any company can measure their footprint and can develop and verify. We work with a wide variety of sectors all over the board. And some of them are doing it voluntarily, a few are doing it to meet compliance obligations. But really, any company that's interested in being an environmental leader, that's interested in reducing the financial burden associated with greenhouse gas emissions, anything along those lines can measure their carbon footprint. So this is my last slide, just talking about where the field is going. As I've mentioned, Massachusetts and California already have mandatory reporting programs. The country is watching the California Cap and Trade program to see how successful it is. If it is successful, it's very likely that within the next 10 to 20 years, the nation will adopt a mandatory reporting program, meaning that any entity, over a certain threshold will have to report their emissions and then have to begin abating it. Are you in a state that's considering adopting mandatory reporting? Stakeholders are definitely demanding it. As Candace mentioned, Walmart is encouraging their suppliers to reduce their emissions in any way possible so that Walmart's emissions are smaller. Walmart isn't the only stakeholder. Maybe your end-use customers are demanding a product with a smaller footprint, or your investors. Leading me to the next point, which if you report to the CDP, financial professionals look at that information and they use that information to make investment decisions. There was a recent Economist article about big companies setting internal carbon prices to be ahead of regulation. Disney, ExxonMobil, Shell, all of these companies set an internal price so that they know the intrinsic value of carbon for each of their programs and then how it's going to play out in the future. Also, as Candace and Steve mentioned, influencing supply chain decisions. Your suppliers might want a more environmentally preferable product, or maybe you want a more environmentally preferable product from your suppliers, and you have to measure your footprint to understand where you can take emissions earlier in your supply chain. And last but not least, Scope 3 reporting is definitely changing the game. Because the Scope 3 protocol put out by the World Resources Institute recently better helps companies define their how to calculate their Scope 3 emissions, and just companies that are desiring more and more clarity and accuracy in their footprinting, more Scope 3 emissions are being captured. One thing to keep in mind here is that you don't want to double count, so your Scope 3 emissions might be somebody else's Scope 1 emissions. Make sure you're putting them in the right category.
Okay, so that concludes our portion of, or that includes the content of the presentation. What I'm going to do is open it up for questions. We may be able to go a few minutes over if people have time. And I did want to start out with just a couple of questions for Delta Airlines. One of them was, the understanding was that the Scope 1, that the fuel was covered under Scope 1 emissions, and the question was, how is Delta using Scope 2 emissions? And then the other question was asking for a bit more elaboration on how Delta influences the supply chain, its supply chain through carbon footprinting practice. And Steve, I believe you're unmuted.
I didn't hear the first question, Elise.
The first question was, how is Delta using Scope 2 emissions to make decisions? And the second question was, how is Delta influencing its supply chain with carbon footprinting?
Well, Scope 2 is basically our electricity, and frankly, we don't even have visibility to electricity use at airports, since the airports get the bills and pay the bills, and we just pay a lease. So we have very little influence on electricity usage there, and frankly, even if we stop using all electricity, it would hardly move our carbon footprint. So even though we are doing things on our campus, like installing occupancy sensors and nighttime setbacks of thermostats and things like that, they frankly don't move the needle much, because jet fuel, our Scope 1 emissions is so large in comparison to Scope 2. So it's very difficult to justify projects to reduce Scope 2 emissions.
Right.
Got it. And the question of how you use your carbon footprint to influence the supply chain.
Right now, focus our supply chain team is, I think, mostly on social sustainability issues more than environmental issues. Again, our big suppliers like the Boeings and the GEs, we're not going to influence them. They're already doing a lot of impressive things. So we're not. We're focusing on our own huge footprint from jet fuel and not trying to bully our suppliers into doing things until we can demonstrate to them that we're doing things.
Great, thanks, Steve. The next question is about ISO 14067 as a standard for carbon footprinting. And just to give a little bit of background, 14067 is a carbon footprinting standard for products. So throughout this entire presentation, we've been talking about the carbon footprinting of entities or corporations, organizations. There's a different standard for footprinting on products, and that's because you want to really drill down into the inputs and outputs of the product. It's a great standard. Internally, we do carbon footprint product verification. So if you're interested in that, we'd be happy to talk to you more about that outside of the presentation.
Okay, are there any further questions? If folks have further questions, please ask them. Oh, we do have another one.
So the next question is about how carbon neutral and carbon footprinting is related in a paper mill. I believe if I understand this question, any company can essentially attempt carbon neutrality. The first step is always to establish your footprint, get that verified, and then you can move on to neutrality. There are standards in place like PAWS, Publicly Available Specification 2060-2060, that set a global standard for carbon neutrality, and that allows companies to develop a carbon neutrality plan. What they can do is in that first year of neutrality, they can offset 100% of their emissions using carbon credits. But every year thereafter, they have to start to actually implement neutrality initiatives that help to lower the carbon footprint in addition to using offsets. There are other carbon neutral standards out there, but that's probably the best global standard available. The next question, I believe is for us, and is about considering the GRI, the Global Reporting Initiative G4 guidelines when auditing a company for their CO2 footprint or their GHG inventory. We can do GRI, we can absolutely do GRI verifications. They're a bit more comprehensive because it's more than just the footprint data. There's more climate data in there. And if you would like to talk to us more about that, we'd be happy to talk to you.
Okay, great. Thank you, everyone. Are there any further questions that folks would like to ask? I did want to share the contact information for the presenters. It looks like we do have one more question.
So the last question is, would a third party like SES have a say on the verification scope? Looks like, yeah. So we do not choose the verification scope or the sustainability reporting parameters. That's done by you, and we set that when we send a proposal, we scope it, and when we go through the kickoff call, we scope it, and we keep kind of revisiting the scope to make sure that you're comfortable with what you've reported. It depends on which of the protocols you choose. Some might say that you have to report this, or you have to report that, or this is optional, but SCS, that's outside of the bounds of our ability.
Okay, that concludes the Q&A session. I wanted to thank everyone for coming. Thank you for your patience with the technical difficulties, and thank you to Steve and Stephanie from Delta and to Candace from Fruit of the Loom for your time and for your expertise. We really appreciate it. Feel free to follow up with us or with any of us with further questions or thoughts. And as I mentioned, we will make these slides available after the presentation. So once again, thank you.